Thanks for joining us on this week's episode of Lawyers on the Rocks. The Lawyers on the Rocks are Jeremy Eldridge, me, Kurt Nachman, and Adam Crandall. We're produced by Gideon at Up Next Creative. Jeremy Eldridge practices criminal defense. I'm Kurt Nachman. I handle civil litigation and personal injury matters, and Adam Crandall does whatever it is that immigration lawyers do.
We know what he does. He's Professor Crandall, and if you need to know what he does, you just go to the University of Maryland Law School website, and he has his whole bio there.
Can I get through my intro?
No.
Professor Attorney Crandall Esquire .org.
Came with the glasses, homie.
I didn't realize you had your own TLD.
Since you got those glasses, by the way.
What's that?
You've been insufferable since you got those glasses. I just want to.
I just like looking down them at you.
You definitely.
He's become an old man. It's aged him 20 years, and he now looks like Grandpa Professor Crandall. So it also came with a pipe.
On this week's episode, we are joined by special guest, the Honorable George Hazel. He's in the waiting room. He's going to join us in a second. We are sampling the Jubilee juice for Juneteenth, which is very alliterative, tongue-tying word. Can we bring in Judge Hazel?
You got it.
I wish we had fake applause right now. Like we have a live audience and no applause.
I know, no applause. Good afternoon, Judge Hazel. It's very good to see you.
Good afternoon.
Hold on, I'm sitting while a judge enters. This is a first.
I know. Are we supposed to stand up?
I was expecting it. I'm a little.
Can you say be seated?
Sitting here. I mean,
I do the fake stand up like when you normally come in.
I used to stand when I walk into the room. But that's acceptable. That's acceptable. Good to
That's
see
the
you
most
guys.
exercise I've gotten today. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. We've been really looking forward to this episode. I know it's gotten kicked around a little bit, and we really appreciate you taking time out of your day to join us. We are all sampling the Juneteenth Jubilee juice, which is a special cocktail that Adam had located on what was the website?
So
Adam?
it's a publication called The Bitter Southerner. It's a sort of multimedia publication. They do some print stuff, some film, some photography. It's run by a group out of Atlanta who are sort of dedicated to this concept of a better South, a more progressive South. And a lot of the stuff that they run sort of harkens back to Southern culinary traditions and other sort of Southern cultural traditions, the good ones. And so this week,
Thank you for clarifying.
Right? Again, that's the sort of the whole idea. So this week they ran a piece that was actually written by a self-described Texas and Louisiana raised Atlanta-based mixologist named Tiffany Barrier, who put together a red celebration drink, which you can have with or without alcohol, and it's in honor of Juneteenth, which apparently, and some of the article goes into. I'll send you the link, Kurt. We can link it. Yep. It goes into talking about sort of the tradition with a red drink surrounding the Jubilee. The Juneteenth celebration. The recipe is 2 ounces of your favorite spirit, optional. 2 ounces of hibiscus tea or pomegranate juice. It's 3/4 ounce lemon juice, 3/4 ounces of honey syrup, and ginger beer, and it is quite tasty.
Judge Hazel, I want to say this so you don't have to say it. I'm so glad that you could be with us because there would have been nothing more comfortable than 4 white men sitting around drinking this drink on Juneteenth. And I'd like recognizing awkwardness. Yeah. So
I'm glad I can help you. I'm glad I can help you. I don't know that I'll be available every year, so you need to have more than one black friend.
Once again, I'm glad I also didn't have to make that joke. My wife Shantae offered to come on today.
That's right. So you have at least two. You have at least.
Yeah, I told her, but if her company Amazon wasn't sponsoring the event, then she wasn't invited. Yeah. And Amazon also gave her off for Juneteenth, so she actually took off.
Nice.
So, Judge, we really want to thank you for joining us, but we have some very important questions to kind of warm things up before we get going. So, sure. For those listeners who don't know, you are a New York native. Is that right?
Indeed. Mm-hmm.
And you are a New York Knickerbockers fan. Is that right?
That is absolutely right. Die hard.
He was until the playoffs ended.
No. And I saw, not to go too behind the curtains, but I did see, the notes that you sent around ahead of time. You said sad Knicks fan. I pushed back on that. This was a fantastic season. We were the 4th seed. The team that we lost to is now up 3-2. We have a bright and brilliant future. So I am a happy, proud Knicks fan as I sit here.
I wanted you to empathize or sympathize with me as a Wizards fan, and I thought that we could mourn together. But you're right. Yeah. The Wizards just always shameful and embarrassing, and your team had the best season it's had in 15 years. So
were the playoffs disappointing? Yeah. I mean, Julius Randle did not play very well, but I feel good about our future.
So the other important New York sports-related questions are Yankees or Mets?
That's a tough one. And this is one where I get a lot of flack because I've been both, which you're just not supposed to be.
I'm pretty sure you're not allowed to do that. Isn't that against the law in the state of New York?
I think it is. I grew up a Mets fan, and 1986, and some of you might be too young to even really remember it thoroughly as I do. But 1986, one of my favorite memories as a sports fan. But at some point, when I became an adult, rooting for the Knicks, who are always terrible, the Jets, who are always terrible, I just decided I deserved some joy in my life. And so I switched from the Mets to the Yankees, just so there could at least be one team in my life that from time to time actually had some success. So I did make that switch at some point.
Is that amnesty available in Baltimore?
Yes, there's a lot of Yankee fans running around Baltimore.
Yeah. Seriously,
it's true.
At some point, you gotta
switch your affiliation when you were working here in Baltimore to the
Orioles. I did not switch to the Orioles. I can tolerate the National. My son roots for the Wizards, and so just for his sake,
what a smart young man! What a wonderful young man! Your progeny.
Roots for the Wizards.
So you attended Morehouse College for undergrad, right?
Indeed, I did.
And Georgetown Law School. What these are all kind of the typical questions that we ask all of our lawyer folks that come on. What made you want to become an attorney?
Sure. I don't know that I have some really thoughtful, deep reason. I think, I've always been a bit of a ham. There's a part of me that likes performance. At some point, I realized, I can't sing, I can't dance, I'm not athletic, I'm not coordinated. There really wasn't a lot left other than the prospect of standing in front of a jury and, running my mouth for a little while, right? And so, I remember as a kid sort of watching courtroom dramas and even court TV and finding it really, really cool and just saying, hey, I think I could do that. That would be a lot of fun. I think later in life, maybe I saw more meaning in the work and that might have influenced some of the jobs I've done. But yeah, as a young person, it was just oh, that looks cool. I think I could do that. And yeah, it was all about being a trial lawyer in particular. I wanted to be in a courtroom.
And in the trial world, you've sort of done a little bit of everything, right? You were on the civil side, according to your bio, when you first came out of law school, and then you were at the U.S. Attorney's Office, and then you were our boss in the state's attorney's office.
Deputy state's attorney.
Deputy state's attorney for Baltimore City.
Chief deputy.
Do I have to stand for that one too?
I actually think you should, but it's okay.
I spent enough time in his office when he was my boss. Go to the principal.
Yeah, go to the principal's office.
Yeah.
So can you talk about kind of your progression through those various roles and what changed and then what changed in your perspective? And then obviously we'll get to being a judge, but
sure.
Sort of backing up.
I'll try to give the short version so I don't take up the whole hour with that. But yeah, I started out at a law firm at Weil, Gotshal & Manges. We talked about being a trial lawyer. My very first trial as a lawyer was in New York State Supreme Court, which, at least in the time, I think it's still true. In New York, that's the trial court, the Supreme Court. And so I had a trial there. And of course, working for a big law firm, when I say had a trial, it means I sat in the second seat while the very powerful, important partner actually tried the case. And I handed him his documents and proofread the motions, right? Because I was at a law firm. It was a big law firm, a multi-million-dollar case. They weren't putting me there. I at least got to see a courtroom, be in a courtroom, and work on that. And so it was a pretty cool experience. I spent 5.5 years at Weil, Gotshal. As big law firms go, I actually felt like I had a good experience. I had that trial. I did get to argue some motions, do some depositions. Again, as law firm experience goes, it was actually, I felt pretty rewarding, and I love the people there. I've always been fortunate, and this includes present company, that I've always been really fortunate to have really cool people around me in places where I worked, and that was certainly true at Weil Gotshal. It certainly includes present.
He's talking about me, guys.
Yeah. But at some point I did feel like I wanted to be a public servant, and I knew that was the goal. And so maybe it was 3-4 years in, I applied to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Maryland. I got rejected, which I sometimes point out to them now because I'm now a federal judge in that courthouse. The U.S. Attorney's Office rejected me. So it's a point that I make from time to time.
Do you attach that denial to the back of denial of continuance requests?
Yeah, exactly. Every time, I still have the letter, and exactly, I should attach it to every time I deny one of the motions. So I went to the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C., which, in hindsight, as you might know, U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C., it's a lot like state court practice. You're in D.C. Superior before you advance to federal court. So that actually gave me the chance to have a growth experience, much like you guys had, right? Like just coming up, doing local crime, just trying cases with, frankly, at the time, low stakes, just getting in there and learning how to be a trial lawyer. It was a great experience. I actually pushed some of my law clerks now to go to the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C. if they want to be in AUSA. So I did that, but my dream was to do it in Maryland at some point. So came back and did it in Maryland for, 3-ish years there. And then this guy who a couple of us know a little bit, named Greg Bernstein, got himself elected state's attorney. He and I were not, I wouldn't say we were friends when he got elected. We had a case together. I prosecuted someone who he then represented, and we had a good enough relationship. It was some back and forth. If you know Greg as a lawyer, he argues hard. So it was some back and forth, but I think we respected each other, and knew each other enough to say hi in the courtroom or courthouse when we saw each other. Kept in touch. Got himself elected. Gave me a call one day and talked me into it, coming and working with you guys. And then at some point, I got the opportunity to do this job, which has been the dream of a lifetime. So that's the 3-minute version. I can give you the longer version, but that's the sort of 3-minute version of some of the stuff I've done over the course of my career.
Well, so let's talk a little bit about your time in the state's attorney's office. So you were there for what, about 4 years?
Yeah, just shy of 4 years. I started with Greg. He had actually worked it out that I got to be there, believe it or not, on the payroll the last 2 months of the Jessamy administration. You may not have been aware. They tucked me away in some basement somewhere that, I don't know if it had air or heat or windows or anything.
Most of us didn't have a window, and most of us were in a basement environment.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough.
He's like, they tucked me in a basement. I'm like, they gave you an office. Like my office was next to the bathroom. I could hear every flush. It was great.
So fair enough. I shouldn't take it personally, and I didn't take it personally, but because it was actually kind of Miss Jessamy to allow that, right? So I started, I guess technically, November of whatever year that would have been. I guess that would have been 2010, and stayed until about May of 2014. So it ended up being just shy of 4 years.
Can you tell us about what that experience was like? Or first of all, what units were you in charge of as Chief Deputy State's Attorney? Chief Deputy State's Attorney.
All of them, Kurt.
Yes, let's be clear about that in case Elizabeth is listening. She might be the only one who cares about me emphasizing that, but if she's listening, I want her to know and to be reminded of it. So as Chief Deputy State's Attorney, I had, I think, all of the felony units, and then for those who might not know, homicide, originally general felonies before we went to the community prosecution model, general felonies, what was the 5 unit when I got there, narcotics, all the standard felony units. And then when we went to the community prosecution model, that was broken up. We created major investigations unit, which I had a hand in creating. That was under my umbrella. And then I actually took on misdemeanor jury trial. I think I did anyway, as part of the community prosecution law.
And when you say community prosecution, what does that mean relative to how it was set up before you were there and how it's set up now?
So I can't speak to now, and that might be a recurring.
Well, it's been erased now, so that it's done.
Yeah, exactly. I can't speak to now. I can speak to what it was when I found it and what it was when I left it. So community prosecution was actually something that I had become familiar with just from sort of my work as a prosecutor prior to going to work for Greg, right? So it wasn't something that I just sort of, certainly not something I made up myself. And the idea is, trying to, rather than just being subject matter based, which most prosecutors' offices tend to be, it was more focused on communities and learning the communities that you really serve. And the way we did that as a practical matter is we took general felonies, the 5 unit, which was the handgun and shootings unit. We took the narcotics unit, and I feel like I'm missing one. I think we did put misdemeanor jury trial in there. And we broke them out into 3 sections of the city. And so rather than coming into felonies and then going to narcotics and general felonies or whatever, you were assigned to, say, zone 1, which would be the eastern part of the city. And as you progress through your entire career, your cases would come from that area of the city. And the idea was that well-informed prosecutors make better decisions. And so the better you got to know the area, whether it's the Eastern District, Western District, the better you got to know your area, the better decisions you could make. You were better able to say, Jeremy Eldridge is just a nuisance. And so, his drug case, it's a nuisance. He's just a little short dude who yells at people. And who cares about Jeremy Eldridge?
He knows me so well.
Yeah. So we don't have to worry about it. Kurt Nachman is like an actual scary dude. Like he's like 7 feet tall and, he really like hurts people and he's violent. And you have a better chance of knowing that.
This sounds like our children's book we're writing.
You have a better chance of knowing that if like you had Kurt Nachman's misdemeanor case and, the person who's sitting next to you, because you're all in that unit together, right? You've got a seasoned violent crime prosecutor sitting next to the misdemeanor guy. And so if the person's next to you is like, oh, no, you picked up Kurt Nachman's case? Hey, I have him on a violent crime. Like, let's work together on this, right? Because you're all now part of the same unit. And so, you can just make better decisions when you're more informed. I go on and on about this, but, one thing that I always marvel at from every perspective I've served in the law is that the prosecutor is often the most powerful, influential person in the courtroom, and also often the youngest and least experienced, right? Like both of those things are often true, just the way people tend to go through their careers, you guys being examples of that, right? So the more, not just experience, because it's hard to manufacture experience, but the more knowledge you can get into a prosecutor's head, including this is the problems in this city. This is a big deal case in this area. In this area, it's more of a nuisance. But over here, like we're having a real uptick in crime. There's a war breaking out here. Like this case, how this case prosecutes actually might matter on the streets in terms of lives being saved. And so that in a nutshell is community prosecution. And then we had the homicide prosecutors and even MIU, major investigations, even though they didn't get sort of baked in, they still assigned cases based on sections of the city. So that's how community prosecution.
Just to come back to something you said, because we've discussed on almost every episode we've done the role of the prosecutor. And I don't think a lot of people realize that, to use the U.S. Attorney's Office, that there are law firms that will loan out their associates, as of course, for a year or two to get trial experience. So you're talking about bringing someone from civil private practice that has never been in a courtroom and then handing them federal drug cases for the most part, right? Because you're not handing them a ton of violent crime, but saying go into court and prosecute these what are arguably somewhat serious cases in order to train them up, and then the law firms are paying them, and it's always been a little bit of a trade, and then they go back. And then on the state court side, in district court, that's where it really doesn't matter, because the most serious cases are bar fights and DUIs. And it's not that they're not serious to the individual coming into the courtroom, but they are obviously less serious than
the public policy purposes
than
it's
homicides,
less serious, right?
But I think what you just said is really important, because I think that you said two very important things, right? That they have the least experience and they have the most power. They're the least educated, but they also tend to be, honestly, know the least about the person in the courtroom outside of the case. And the thing that I liked about the community prosecution model, although that's when, frankly, Kurt and I started our own practice, was that when I was a prosecutor, I had 300 drug cases. And one of the reasons that I left was I didn't know anything about these people. So unless the detective on a case called me and said, this, to use the word bad dude, right? He's a bad dude, then I might pay a little extra attention. But it's very difficult unless you're dealing with a violent crime where you just know by virtue of this offense, this person should be penalized, whether incarceration, probation, whatever. But in a drug case, it's really hard to tell, especially with 300 cases. And that's something that when you and Greg came in, that you changed, because it was no longer about handling too many cases with too little knowledge about who you were prosecuting. And it's also really hard, like you said, to focus on who to prosecute when you know nothing about them. And at 300 cases, Kurt knows this, I was disillusioned because most of them were between the age of 19 and 22. They were young black men. They had minimal records. And my virtue of my work, whether I want to admit it or not, we were saddling these young men with multiple felony drug convictions, and people would come in and plead young guys out to one or two cases at a time. And next thing you know, you've ruined their job prospects. Yeah. Who cares about their ability to carry a firearm, candidly, but you've ruined their futures insofar as being able to vote and being able to have a productive place in society, all within 3 minutes when a 19 to 20-year-old knows nothing about any of that stuff. So I do think within the hands of a prosecutor, I know that you did it when you were in the office, but that's a role we talk about, that prosecutors need to visit jails and know what jails look like before they ask for jail time. They need to understand the role of a felony conviction on someone's record.
How about when we were in district court, I set up an opportunity for the district court level prosecutors to go to a gun range and fire a firearm. And I was shocked that these people are putting people in jail or asking people to be put in jail for a firearm, and yet have never fired one, don't understand or appreciate sort of the gravity of using a 45 versus a 22 versus a 380, and the different kind of feels that they have. Like if someone gets pulled over and they have, a Desert Eagle 50 cal in their pocket versus, a little pea shooter like 22, like there is a difference there, and the prosecutors didn't have any knowledge at the district court level.
So, which brings me to my new idea, which was with the immigration lawyers, George, and then I'll let you transition. We should deport them at least once, and so they know what being deported is like, and then we should make them fucking cross over La Frontera, right, con coyote, and then they'll really understand what it's like to live a troubled life and come to America.
So let me say a couple of things, because you both said things that I think are worth sort of adding on to the idea of seeing things from a different perspective. I think one of the issues, it's not just in the criminal justice system, right? It's everywhere in the world, but we're focused on criminal justice at the moment, is the polarization, right? Like you're on this side or you're on that side. One of the things I talk to interns about when they let me speak to interns at the courthouse is, if you're thinking about being a prosecutor, you absolutely, and I've done this, you're absolutely right, you absolutely should visit a prison and see what that is like. A federal prison, a local prison, and I've had the opportunity to do both. Like, see what that's like. Understand.
I got you out, though. I got you out.
Yeah, I appreciate that. You need to understand what that's like. At the same time, though, and again, that's what I'm saying, it goes both ways. If you want to be a public defender, and which I think is phenomenal, just to be clear, it happens to not be on my resume, but I think it's a phenomenal thing to do. You should also understand what it's like to be a mother of a homicide victim, right? And what that means. I think both are true. I just think, and again, I could expand that to almost anything in society, but I just think we need to do a better job of understanding what the other side's perspective is, so that then if you're a prosecutor, you can really understand what it is to say, I'm sending someone to prison and how meaningful that is. And if you're on the defense side, you can understand, at least have some, and obviously your role's different, but have some understanding of, the heartbreak, the passion, what's going on from the other side. And I just think that helps us all be better practitioners when we have that understanding.
Speaking of being better or worse practitioners, obviously you were not deputy state's attorney post Freddie Gray.
Sure indeed.
You had already been appointed to the bench, but obviously since 2014, a tremendous number of things have changed. We've had the Black Lives Matter movement. Obviously today is a national holiday. Celebrated today, it's tomorrow. How would those types of things have impacted your thought process in terms of prosecution? Would you have adopted potentially a more progressive model like we see being implemented in Philadelphia and Baltimore to some degrees of success?
I think that's an excellent question. I think I do spending a lot of time reflecting back on not just my time at the state's attorney's office, but even when I was in AUSA and some of the cases I handled, and some of the things I was involved in then. And what I think I would say, and this sort of goes back to my last answer in a way, is that often the answer is somewhere in the middle, where I think I would have today, and part of this is just the wisdom of years also, probably a greater appreciation of things like, frankly, that cops lie. And if I'm being candid, I think particularly when I was a junior AUSA, I don't know that I would have believed that. That's just being honest, right? Like I think I was someone who was probably somewhat naive, and that's something that through experience I learned and saw, and I don't want to make myself sound too naive. I obviously had some understanding of that, but I think particularly spending time in Baltimore City, and the cases are legion, we don't have to list them all, you gain a greater understanding of there being real, serious, and systemic problems in policing and how that can impact people. And I certainly think that if I had an understanding of that, a better understanding of that at the time, one of the things, I'll say this, one of the things that I realized during the end of my tenure at the state's attorney's office is that I was spending more and more time with my police integrity chief than I was with my homicide chief, right? When I started in the office as the state's attorney's office, as the chief deputy state's attorney, my focus, my laser attention was on what we can do to reduce violent crime. That was, and this won't surprise you guys because you guys were there for some time. Like that was the focus. Like, what can we do? How do we go after violent repeat offenders? How do we get them, the most violent people, off the streets? Because one thing that I often point out is it is a sad fact that it's people like me who suffer from mass incarceration and police violence. It's also people like me who suffer from violence, right? Just in the city. And so I was laser focused on the latter. And I think as time went on and the problems caused by police brutality, by police mischief, misconduct, became just more and more apparent. I think now I just have a better sense of how you need to be focused on both. And I worry sometimes, this is me now just looking from 50,000 feet away, that the pendulum can swing from side to side, where for a period of time, all we hear about is we got to reduce violent crime, we got to get the violent repeat offenders, we got to do this, we got to do that.
The H number. Yeah, people are obsessed in Baltimore City with the homicide number.
Correct. That's you go through periods of time where that's the focus. And then it switches all the way to the other side, where now the only thing you hear about is constitutional policing and the need to reform the police. And here's the thing, and I don't think this should be controversial, both are critically important, right? Like, we need to get to a place where we have constitutional, consistent, like every day, it's the norm and the standard and the expectation, constitutional policing by police officers who are there to actually serve and protect the communities they're supposed to serve and protect. That whatever we need to do to get there, we need to do that. At the same time, we need to figure out why there's so much violent crime and what we can do about that. And what's happened, frankly, whether it's Baltimore City or you might look at other cities, to take us from a point where we're in the low 200s every year to the low to mid 300s every year. Like, somebody should be worried about, and I assume somebody is. I'm in my ivory tower in Greenbelt now, right? I assume somebody is worried about it.
There are definitely no ivory towers in Greenbelt. I mean, having gone to Eleanor Roosevelt High School off Hanover Park,
as ivory as the tower gets there.
That's fair. I'll give you that. You are at the top of a hill.
Yeah. But somebody needs to be like waking up every day. And this is what I tried to do. Waking up every day, figuring out how Baltimore City can be safer. And I pray and hope there are people doing that. I'm sure there are people doing that. But people need to be coming up with ideas and thinking about, like, what can we do? Why did we get to this place and how do we get it back down? And thinking about how do we do it in a way that's constitutional, that respects the rights of citizens, that protects and serves. Like, we got to be doing both. I feel like we have a camp that wants to do one, a camp that wants to do the other.
Well, let me throw something out at you, which I think proves your point, which is in that pendulum swing since 2015, we've seen an H number that when you were deputy state's attorney, that was in the high ones, low twos, top 300 every year since Marilyn Mosby's been the state's attorney, number one. And number two, during that same time period, we've seen the consent decree, which, although Maryland doesn't want to acknowledge it, the feds were coming in, as Your Honor knows, well before Maryland took off. I mean, this was already happening, consent decree. It's not like Maryland went to DOJ and really begged for their involvement, like she says. So with that pendulum swing towards constitutional policing, we saw a 100+ increase per annum in homicides. But during that time, what we saw no effort in doing, outside of the establishment locally of a civilian review board by a former mayor, was any attempt to actually bridge the gap between the police department, the community, and the office of the state's attorney. Because with the Freddie Gray prosecutions, the police department has been fractured and there's been no attempt to repair it. The state's attorney's office still is fighting very publicly and non-publicly with the police department. And the police department now not only struggles to retain employees, struggles to hire new employees, but has now struggles to even make viable arrests due to most of their people feeling some either real or imagined liability upon making arrests. And that's where I think the heart of it is. I'm not saying I have a solution, but what I've seen as a former prosecutor and defense attorney in the city is that everyone is dealing with the overarching issue of consent decree and the policing, and no one is dealing with the fact that we have to repair the relationship between the police and the community and the state's attorney's office, because without them, the toilet's not going to flush, frankly. And that's where I get stuck.
So a couple things you said there that I want to respond to. One, I want to be clear that you drew a straight line. I would say that somebody needs to look at whether the things you've mentioned are correlation or causation, right? And what's what. And I learned those terms in my son's 8th grade algebra class about a week ago. Correlation and causation. 8th grade algebra.
You do have a little math teacher, do you? I have to be honest with you.
Yeah. I mean, the glasses help with that too.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I think, and look, and I want to be clear, I'm not just saying that as like I'm a judge now, so I'm dodging politics. I mean that like truly, somebody should study what's correlation, what's causation. I don't know. I haven't studied it, but I think somebody should, right? So I mean, for years, the homicides were in the low 200s, and for the last 5-6 years, they've been in the 300s. Like that, something happened. Like I don't know, but somebody should figure that out.
I'll tell you this. I know that Hopkins used to have, and Sean, unfortunately, I can't remember his last name, who is now Maryland Public Policy Institute. There used to be more of an affiliation between Hopkins and some of the analytics that were provided to the Governor's Office of Crime Control and Prevention and the State's Attorney's Office. And those relationships, much like some of the local partnerships or collaborations that we had, one of which I used to bring up to Greg Bernstein that he didn't like at all, that I was on that I'm not going to mention, which was a collaboration between the governor and local state's attorney's office, the police department, public defender's office. But without those collaborations and without the universities being involved in the analytics, your point couldn't be more well taken. I mean, we're in a city with one of the best research schools in the country, the number one most funded research school in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. And
this
so I want to be clear.
Is at our fingertips.
Yeah. And so I want to be clear, like it's, public safety isn't my thing now. It's one of a number of factors I consider when sentencing a defendant, right? But
that was good.
It's not my thing now. And so I want to be clear. I'm not sitting around reading up on this. I'm putting on my old hat of when I used to consider myself sort of the crime strategist. And yeah, I'd like to read studies to try to get a sense of, wow, is there anything we can do from the prosecutor's office that could actually reduce crimes? And the thing that, we kept coming back to are violent repeat offenders, not arresting everybody, right? Like, I don't think that helps. Mass incarceration does not help reduce violent crime, but certainly targeting the most violent people does. I think a lot of places have demonstrated that that's something that can be effective. The other thing you said that I want to respond to is the relationship between the state attorney's office and the police department. Again, I can't speak to what's happening now. I'm not there now, but I know that when I was there, I went to ComStat every week, and I found that important. And I had lunch with whoever had sort of the corollary position to mine at the police department. So it was Tony Barksdale for a while, Palmer at some point, others at some point. Whoever was the deputy of operations, I would have lunch with deputy commissioner of operations. I would have lunch with that person, maybe monthly. And we certainly had each other's phone numbers and would talk frequently. And here's the thing, someone will hear that and think, oh, so they're just like a pocket of the police officers. No, we frequently argued. We probably spent as much time in those conversations arguing about stuff like, why don't you guys charge this case, or why don't you charge that case, right? Part of the reason why we spoke so often is because he might call me or I might call him and say, God, this detective brought this case, it's trash. I don't care how much you guys are yelling at me, we're not charging it. And vice versa. They'd call and yell at me like, your ASA is doing this.
Knowing Barksdale, he doesn't argue on Twitter at all. Barksdale was not an opinionated deputy commissioner or chief of operations at all.
Not at all. But we actually had a great relationship. We argued sometimes because we had different.
He was a hell of a cop.
We had different perspectives. We argued sometimes, but we had that relationship. And I don't know. Again, there's a lot of different ways to do a lot of different jobs. I don't know how I could have done that job without the relationship that I had with them, because it meant that I had someone to talk to, whether it was to give good news, bad news, or just argue out an issue where I can get their perspective, they can get my perspective. Again, I don't know how every prosecutor office works in terms of their relationship with the police department, but I felt that was important to me, and I know Greg agreed, to have a relationship. So even as some of the things we talked about earlier, moving to community prosecution, forming major investigations, a lot of those things we ran by the police department to sort of get some sense, like, all right, which districts should we put together in our community prosecution plan, right? Like, we wanted their feedback to see how that would work. How can we marry up, some of our folks with some of your folks to make sure people know the good cops, the bad cops, the cops whose cases they shouldn't take, the cops, and you look back and now you should have done even more of that, frankly. But just in terms of like being able to really identify and do something with, people you just discover to be bad cops. But that was a necessary, I felt, part of the job. And, if someone else does the job differently, they do it differently. But the way I did it, I wanted to have that relationship.
All right. So we've run way over, which is perfectly fine.
Sorry about that.
But
I blame Jeremy.
I agree.
It's always my fault anyway.
But I did want to shift gears a little bit.
Sure.
So we have some other standard questions that we always ask.
Okay.
And since you're a judge, I want to know, what is your absolute biggest pet peeve on the bench?
My biggest pet peeve, I guess taking it from a more serious standpoint, it's just lack of preparation.
This interview.
I think you guys were well prepared for this. Lack of preparation. I mean, I think that, and I can get into the minutia on some other things with trigger lawyers, but yeah, federal court, unlike state court where it's such a volume game, and we talked about that a little bit. In federal court, it's like, yeah, usually we planned this out pretty well. You knew today was the day. You didn't think you were going to get a continuance. That doesn't really happen here. There's really no reason for you not to be completely prepared. And so anything that demonstrates a lack of preparation. I also don't like snarkiness between lawyers. I usually just start to tune it out. I've got kids. I get that at home. I don't need to go to work and hear two lawyers bickering about something that's nonsense. And so that becomes a pretty big one.
Have you ever referred to lawyers as children from the bench?
I often make the comparison that I just made between lawyers who are arguing and my children. So I don't call them children. That would be mean. But I often draw the comparison between the situation I'm in at the moment and a situation that I'll be in when I get home with my kids.
That is very judicial of you.
I try. I don't want to insult anybody.
So, what is your funniest courtroom story?
Yeah, I was worried about that question because I don't know that I have like some really big ha-ha thing. I remember recently, this was like a year and a half ago. So at this point, I'm a judge. And, I had a defendant. I gave him a sentence that he did not agree with. He had been completely respectful the whole time. But then as they're taking him away, just starts swearing at me. And he calls me the N-word. And the clerks, everybody, the staff, and everybody's sort of looking at me, and I'm not even responding. I just, I'm already doing the paperwork. Then he calls me the F word. Everybody in the clerk's still looking at me to see, is the judge going to react and start screaming or doing something to him? I still didn't do anything. Then he called me a mother effer, and I'm still just doing my work. The thing that got my attention and that upset me, he then called me a four-eyed geek. And at that point,
that's what he ended with?
I turned, yes, he led up to four-eyed geek. And it was at that point that he got a rise out of me. And my clerks later asked me, he called you all these offensive things. Why did you get upset at that one? And I said, because that one felt personal. All the others were just him lashing out, coming up with any offensive thing.
I mean,
he actually looked at me. He looked at me and came up with four-eyed geek. That felt personal. That's when I took offense. So yeah, that's my best story. But yeah,
that wasn't a bad one.
No, that's a good one.
I thought it was going to be underwhelming when he started telling it. And then no, that was pretty good. You sold us.
I try to lower the bar. I lower the bar.
And so this next question is kind of like a two-pronged question, right? Because it can be the same case or it can be a different case. And sometimes, we've had responses that are tragic, that are, wonderful, that are heartwarming, that are funny, whatever. What is your best case or favorite case? And then what is the case that you handled in your career that you are most proud of?
Sure. That would be probably the same case. United States versus Johnny Butler was, if there's a case that sort of, defines what I believe prosecution, particularly at the federal level, can be, that's probably it. This is a guy who, so far as we know, was responsible for two murders, including the brother of a drug dealer he had a beef with, and the girlfriend of a drug dealer he had a beef with. It's a special kind of vengeance where you don't go after the person, you go after the person closest to him. That's who he was. We didn't have enough to get him on either murder originally. And so we did a wiretap, drug investigation. He led a drug crew. And over the course of time, we were able to, and I'll shorten the story, get him and 10 other associates indicted. And what always happens in these cases when it's on a wiretap and you start playing phone calls for people, they start turning on their friends and colleagues. And we were able to then build both homicide cases in addition to the drug case. One of the homicide cases ended up going to the state attorney's office. Rita Wistoff Ito tried it. One of them was wrapped into our drug conspiracy case. And now he's serving 2 life sentences. And that's, I never want to be gleeful about anybody being in prison. Humans being in cages always makes me feel weird. But if someone deserves it, that would be an example. And yeah, it was just an example of where, the resources, particularly of the U.S. Attorney's Office, usually you think of homicide cases as being state cases. That was one where we were able to take some of what we were really, really good at and use that to get a violent person off the street. Someone who left on the street would have killed more people, right? And so when you hear me go on and on about violent repeat offenders, that's an example of that. Right? You lock up a guy like that and you are reducing violent crime, because the longer he's on the street, that guy's going to continue to commit violent crimes.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Wasn't there an extended forfeiture with Johnny Butler? I was a recent addition to the narcotics division, and I think he had put homes in his mother or grandmother's name.
Yeah, that also
now Judge Melissa Copeland had gone after him, and while they're fighting over homes he owned, he started sending letters saying, "Give me my fucking Rolexes." Because he was fighting over 2 watches, if I remember correctly, because I saw some correspondence, and Judge Copeland shows me and she goes, "This guy's doing now 2 life sentences." Yeah. There's drug prosecution. The guy's fighting over watches that we may have had like the serial number wrong on, on the forfeiture.
Yeah. So then now Judge, then ASA Copeland, it was a joint investigation, federal state. So she worked on it from the state side. And part of what made that case so much fun, it went to trial, so much fun to try, was it really was sort of a, this is your life. And so, we had pictures of him driving the BMW and driving into his really nice house in the county and going to lavish pool parties with huge ice sculptures and Rolex watches. Like, we put all of that in front of the jury to really paint the picture of who this guy was.
Those boxes took up her entire office. The only reason that as a lawyer, other cases and other lawyer handles is when you walk in the office and there were 4 or 5 boxes as you went in, and they all said Johnny Butler on them.
Yeah. Now she worked very hard on that. She worked very hard.
Small world.
So let's see. So what caused you to want to become a judge? We already did the lawyer question.
Yeah. So it's interesting, and some of this stems from some of what we talked about. Greg and I had a great relationship. He remains a great friend and mentor. He actually brought me into his office one day, closed the door. I worried that I was in trouble. Turned out I wasn't. He, had got intel that, slots were open, and he suggested that I apply if I was interested. And I'll always be grateful to him for a lot of things, but for that in particular, because it was a very generous thing of him to do. I think he liked me and liked my work. So I didn't feel like he was pushing me out the door.
That's the way I've always felt he feels about me. So don't feel bad.
Couldn't wait to help you get started on this law firm. But no, like he ended up being really, really helpful to me. And I needed some convincing. I was 37 at the time. I didn't necessarily think I was even qualified for it. But looking back over my career, I was able to see why I had some decent experiences. And, for some of the reasons, frankly, that we had talked about in terms of some of the things that I was spending more time with my police integrity chief than my homicide chief, I was really starting to get to a point where I was like, who are the good guys and the bad guys? I'm not even sure anymore. And there was a point where I felt like I didn't want to be the referee. I wanted to be a player in the game. And it's interesting how the timing worked. I think I was actually getting to a point in my career where I felt like the referee was actually more needed than a player, at least in the position I was in. And so, yeah, referee sounds boring, but I started to feel like that's what I needed to be at that point.
So what is the process like to become appointed to the federal bench? Like
Sure.
what kind of hoops? I'm assuming there's like an application you fill out.
Yes.
And then there's a lot more beyond that.
There is. And we've just, as a court, gone through the process again. I think just yesterday, we actually got a new judge confirmed in Baltimore.
Yes.
So there is an application, and you fill out the application. It's very long, very thorough, very intense. You get interviewed in most states, I think it's certainly still true in Maryland, by a panel of attorneys assembled by the sitting U.S. senators. You're interviewed by them first. You get whittled down to, I think 30 something of us applied originally when I went through. You get whittled down to about 6 people. You get to go and be interviewed by the sitting United States senators. I remember thinking, if that's as far as I got, that was pretty cool. I got a picture of me and Barbara Mikulski on my office wall. And so I remember thinking, like, I got to meet Senator Mikulski, if nothing else. That was pretty cool. But if you get through that, then they sent, I think, 2 names for every slot. So there were 2 slots at that time. So four names went to the White House. And then I think they only really vet the 2 that they're looking at. So then it was me and one other person. You go through a pretty intensive vetting process. They're pulling up things that you wrote in law school. They're talking to, people who you've worked with well, people who you don't work well with. They're talking to defense lawyers whose clients you prosecuted. One tricky thing, you try to list the names of people who like you, but they're tricky. They'll ask that person, is there anyone else we should talk to about this person? And so then you lose control of the narrative and who they're talking to. And so, you go through all that. If you're lucky enough, you get interviewed at the White House, not by the president for a district judge position, but you get interviewed at the White House EEOB building. So I went through that process. Then you get nominated. DOJ assigns someone to help you prep. You prep for your hearing on the Hill. And then generally, if you get through that, you're in good shape and you are confirmed at some point. So there are a lot of things that can go wrong through that process, but that's the process. And it took from the time I said when Greg brought me into his office, I was 37. I was 39 when I got confirmed.
Since you brought it up, I would like to say that, another federal judge, not you, that shall go unnamed, thought it was wise to put me on the list of people that could be a reference. And at that point, Kurt Nachman used to call me all the time. And he used to pretend to be Theodore Nugent or a couple other very fun names. And so one day I got a call from so-and-so from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And as you know, the FBI doesn't really call the narcotics division a lot. Yeah. So I think it's Kurt or someone like Kurt. And I said, that's great because you got Diego Garcia from the Drug Enforcement Administration. And he goes, no, this is Michael Lewis from the FBI. And I was like, exactly. This is Diego Garcia from the Drug Enforcement Administration. What can I do for you? And he's like, I'm looking for Jeremy Eldridge for the background check of the Honorable for the federal court. And I was like, this is Jeremy Eldridge of the state's attorney's office. And the guy laughed so hard. We end up both being Washington football team fans. And then I thought years later,
I thought you hung up on him.
No, I didn't hang up on him. I just I kept doing the accent because I thought I could just tell him my name and do the accent.
And then he immediately called me and blamed me for it.
It was your fault. And that other individual was appointed to the first time as a federal judge. And now, about 10 years later, has a very good sense of humor about the situation. So I'm glad you didn't put me on. I just want to say,
some told me not to list you. So I did.
I was young and immature at that point. I think I've come a long way, and you helped me, shepherd me into this
in
maturity.
the age, but maybe not the maturity.
I'm still doing the same accents, just in better situations.
So I guess that I want to kind of jump ahead. We had a couple more questions, but I really want to jump ahead and sort of touch on the Zoom court story. There was an Atlantic article, we'll link to it in the show notes, but it essentially sort of posits a bunch of pros and cons for Zoom court pandemic related changes that have been made to the judiciary. Obviously, you're joining us today. I want to get your opinion on kind of how has the pandemic altered irrevocably the way that the judiciary is going to conduct its business, and then what is going to go back to sort of business as usual or pre-pandemic business?
That's interesting. I think for a lot of organizations, including the court, it's just showed us what's possible, right? We had to figure this stuff out. 2 years ago, I don't know that we'd have known that some of this stuff was possible. And so, I'm sure some aspects of it will keep, but I got to think that, and I'm fairly confident that most criminal proceedings, maybe all criminal proceedings, will migrate back to the courtroom, back to in-person courtrooms. I do think more on the civil side, you might see more of this stick around. And part of the reason is just, frankly, rules of criminal procedure and, defend certain rights the defendants have. There's had to be legislation in order to get around some of that stuff based purely on COVID, in order to make it legal to actually take someone's plea, at least in the federal system, to take someone's plea and sentence them by Zoom. And so that will expire at some point, and we'll go back to in-person. We'll have to. But for the civil proceedings, you get a temporary restraining order, an emergency motion from, someone with a lawyer in Indiana. And I mean, this actually happened. The lawyer was from Indiana. And yeah, you can get on a Zoom in 2 hours rather than having to have the person fly in the next day and get, local counsel. I mean, it's, there are certain benefits that we now appreciate that I suspect will stay. But I would guess mostly just in the civil.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to me. So one of the things that the article talks about is, the state of Michigan, the state of Texas. Texas has kind of gone full virtual or all virtual. They conducted like 2 million or 1 million virtual hearings in the last year and a half. Texas, I know my cousin is like a magistrate judge for family law in Texas. In Michigan, she said that she did not miss a single docket. Now, she wasn't conducting trials for most of COVID, but she was conducting settlement conferences, hearings, motions hearings, things of that nature. So
we've done everything but jury trials. I don't think any of my colleagues were ambitious enough to do a civil jury trial by Zoom. I have heard of courts doing that though.
I cannot imagine picking a jury online.
That would be.
I think the state of Washington early on in COVID was the first state to do, and it wasn't even a full-on civil jury trial. It was almost a mock trial, but it was very odd because I guess the parties ended up using it to negotiate. But that was the first one that we featured probably, I think, in April or May of last year.
Yeah.
So one of the quotes from the article is, keeping jurors online jurors present and attentive is a challenge school teachers might recognize. Jurors have been caught exercising, napping, talking to people off screen, and leaving to get snacks.
Yeah, no, that certainly would be the concern with doing a jury trial virtually. I think when it's just the lawyers, the judge, and the defendant for a plea or sentencing, I mean, people are professional and focused. Sometimes I can see someone staring at their screen and tell they're not like staring intently at me. But I just assume it's their notes and not, word scramble or something.
It was, Your Honor.
Well, I was thinking of you actually, as I said it. Just kidding, of course. But yeah, I do think, sentencing someone by Zoom was the one thing I never got fully comfortable with. It's such difficult personal thing to begin with. And, the notion that, I'm looking at someone on a screen and they can't even physically be in a room with me and call me a mother effer if they're not happy with their result. It's not the same.
Well, we've talked about this before. The immigration court, even pre-COVID, because we have detainees in far-flung areas, have relied on what they call VTEL or video telephonic technology, as I use that term loosely, having sat for an hour waiting for the detention center to never connect for their hearing on Tuesday. But it's very difficult for us to, in that environment, we have to put on testimony from our clients, oftentimes with an interpreter, and it's incredibly cumbersome. And this is obviously pre-COVID that we were doing this. So I'm not in a hurry or anxious at all to see any of that technology continue, at least in our setting in the immigration court.
I just hope that we can all digest after this and sitting down with whether it's the judiciary and prosecutors and defense attorneys and whether it's the immigration bar, but to really get some feedback from people, because there are some ways, like for instance, on the criminal side, doing IAs virtually has been pretty easy and helpful. Yeah. Being able as a defense attorney to be able to have a video legal visit, a VLV with my client and share documents instead of wasting an hour of taxpayer funded time at CDF waiting to see a client, although it's frankly a very professionally run place. those are the things that make parties, lives a lot easier. The amount of time that defense attorneys wait at penal institutions to visit clients is insane. So I just hope that we don't erase a lot of the technology outside of the courtroom that's benefiting lawyers. And I have a feeling that a lot of that is going to go away. And I think, I'm just hoping we learn some of these lessons. And that's really the undercurrent, in my opinion, of some of this article is when you talk about evictions, you talk about landlord-tenant actions, you talk about some of these small dollar stuff in district court, parking tickets, speeding tickets. We wrote a letter to the editor in the beginning of COVID that why can't you do your speeding ticket at home in your PJs? We force so many people to leave work and come to court, or frankly make the Division of Corrections transport people around for hearings that maybe aren't critical stage hearings. And I know Your Honor knows what I mean, but these administrative functions, I'm hoping
I get that.
Continue to get away from a lot of this and embrace that technology. And it should be sponsored by the Amazon Web Services. Contact Shantae Aldridge at Shonald at Amazon.com.
So we have woefully run through our time, although it's been extraordinarily enjoyable. So typically at the end of the show, we do a drink review and dad jokes if Jeremy has any new ones.
Sorry.
Yeah. Well, I'll let Jeremy handle those.
What do you call someone who watches chickens for a living? Chicken tender. I got him. I'll leave you with that one. That was good enough.
So what do we think of this drink?
Well, let me take another sip of it. I haven't seen you guys drink it.
It's because they're gone.
Usually when we're in front of a judge, you're also not allowed to drink.
Oh, fair enough. You guys have been sneaking it on me. I didn't even realize that.
This is something you could definitely have more than one of, but like in a dark and stormy, the ginger beer does a nice job of sort of camouflaging the alcohol.
I need to say for the record that mine is in fact non-alcoholic, just for anybody concerned about my reputation here as a
well, you're on this show with us, so your reputation is already shattered.
You're already judged by your company.
What's left of it by just noting it that I'm not in fact drinking on the job.
We actually can put a disclaimer at the bottom for you, like the attorney emails that go out. That's not a problem. We'll superimpose something later. So, come on, Gideon, you are our expert drink reviewer here.
I liked it when I first started drinking it, and I think as it went on, I just felt like the ginger beer just sort of overwhelmed everything. Just sort of tasted mostly like ginger beer to me. We were talking before about how it masked the alcohol, which this may be a controversial opinion, but when I'm drinking alcohol, I tend to want to taste the alcohol. There are definitely times when that's not true, I would say, though. But yeah, like I know that there's lemon in here, and I don't necessarily taste it.
Well, I think the frustrating part for me was it called for 3/4 of an ounce of honey, and I couldn't get the honey to mix in appropriately. I think if you mix the honey in advance, we did pomegranate instead of the hibiscus tea, and if you mix the honey in advance with a hot hibiscus tea, it probably would have melded.
Yeah. Or using a simple syrup, which is a thinner cutting agent.
There are instructions here on how to mix the honey.
Yeah.
On the recipe.
So should we just
chalk
up
to read the recipe? We're the city that reads. Is that RTFR, Your Honor? Are we allowed to say RTFR to opposing counsel? Yeah. We should have done a series of what can we say in front of a judge? Can we say to opposing counsel when they don't know what the fuck they're talking about? Did you read the fucking rule? Did you RTFR? I'm not going to look at him when I say that.
That I think borders on children bickering in court. So I wouldn't.
No, it's adult bickering.
You just taught me something. I don't know that I had heard RTFR. Can I say that from the bit? I never.
RTFR. RTFR. So I had a professor in law school, God rest his soul, Dickie Bourne. He taught Maryland civil procedure, and he taught
some crim too.
Crim, and he taught a couple other civil classes, and he was a civil rights lawyer for the DOJ back in the 60s, and real interesting character. And whenever you asked a dumb question in his class, he would say RTFR because he had this super high pitched hillbilly accent, and he would go RTFR, read the rules.
No.
He also used to call the long arm statutes long dick statutes. He had a.
Well, now we're just going into a whole different area.
He had a name. He just had a name for anything. But I guess if you're at University of Baltimore and you have a bunch of people like me and Kurt sitting in the audience,
Got to keep their attention.
he was very entertaining.
I look forward to seeing RTFR appear in the Federal Register sometime soon, Your Honor.
Yeah. I'll look into that. I'll be sure to work that in.
Well, listen, I really want to thank you for joining us on this episode. I know it's been extremely enjoyable. It's good to see you. I don't think I haven't seen you since definitely since
he fired
2014, since you fired me.
Wow.
Yeah, I think I've bumped into Jeremy once or twice in different places. I don't think I've seen you, Kurt. It's good.
Wasn't
It's great to see
looking
you guys.
down.
It's great to see you guys at least virtually, and hopefully we do this in person.
Definitely.
I'll come bother you in Greenbelt. I have a couple cases out there.
Anytime.
Well, thanks for joining us on this week's episode of Lawyers on the Rocks. We hope you enjoyed listening as much as we enjoyed making. You can check us out online at lawyersontheRocks.com. Email us, Facebook, whatever. Till the next time, sit back, relax, pour yourself a drink, and enjoy the next episode of Lawyers on the Rocks.
He made it sound like we're on Tinder.
I know.
Or whatever. You can find us on Grindr, Tinder, Facebook, Bumble. Swipe right on us.